Well, a little memory test from last week. Last week I began by asking you to think of something. Yeah, I can see how important it was. How important, something important to you, and you, I trust, came up with things that were important. We shared some of those things that were important to us. Okay, hopefully some of you can remember what mattered to you last week. So this morning, excuse me, I want you to think of something that doesn't matter to you. Okay? Now, let's shout out something that doesn't matter to me. Facebook. Okay, hey, there you go. Hopefully TikTok. Went dark yesterday. It'll get saved. Too much money in it. Price of tea in China. Anyone hear that phrase growing up as a kid? Where in the world did we hear that one from? What's that got to do with the price of tea in China? Okay, so what else doesn't matter to us? Liver. I suppose you mean eating it, not yours. Yours is important. Consumption is not. Okay, what else do we have? Sports. There you go. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I can't even call myself a fair weather fan anymore. I mean, I just not for me right now. Anything else? What's that? What kind of car a person drives? Okay, so you're not going to be impressed by some stud of a guy driving some. Okay, gotcha. Yes, Annette. Reality TV. Oh, does that mean I can't like Gold Rush? Or The Amazing Race? Some of us are getting close to home now back there. Be careful. Well, yeah, so for some people, they would never answer that question here because for some people, the answer to that question is something that doesn't matter to me very much, is church. There, oh boy, you guys are smart. Yeah. So today, I would like us to have a conversation around why the church matters. And see, for many, the church it's like a vitamin. It's like a supplement. And that is actually true for some people who actually have been to a church at one point or another. See, there's some who remember Sunday once a month. And there are some who remember Sunday every couple of months. And then there are some who remember church every twice a year, we might say. But for some, the church is something more significant. Now, to throw a little wrinkle into your thinking, if you want to understand the church, we have to understand that the most important time, Monday, is more significant than Sunday. Why, you would ask? Because Sunday is the huddle, okay, to use a football analogy for those of us who don't care about football. Sunday is the huddle. See, Sunday is when we come together and we talk about how we want to become the kind of people that can make the world a better place. Sunday is when we come to invest in each other, alluding to what Lisa said there, and how you get your life invested into, and hopefully as a result of that, you'll have the momentum then to move out into Monday in the right direction. See, Monday is where the rubber hits the road. So what happens Monday is the real evidence of whether Sunday actually matters. Because if Sunday has no impact on Monday, Sunday is irrelevant. Now, you could go bowling, you probably don't want to go for a walk today. There are a lot of Sunday morning news programs that have people's attention. But if Sunday redirects how you live your life Monday and going forward, then Sunday becomes the most significant decision you make every single week. So I mentioned I didn't grow up that much in church. We were more than quarterly, but not a whole lot. In my elementary and junior high years, church was outside our mainstream of experience. I really didn't have my thoughts about the church. The only thing I think I remember was that there was a building that they took out our beloved cornfield. Now, that's where we played combat. That's where we played hide and seek. I mean, we had this great place. It was a newer subdivision. It hadn't been completely taken out, from the farmland. And come to find out, it was a Lutheran church. A Lutheran church took out our beloved cornfield. That wasn't all that nice. And the kids there was one kid down the street, had very strict parents, got yelled at a lot. I come to find out that they were pretty religious in their own understanding. There were times they couldn't play with us because they were worried. Parents seemed to be worried we'd be a bad influence on them. You can't imagine that. So my story was that, as some of you recall, the longer version, but the shorter version was that my dad would die in like December 10th, and it must have been somewhere around November or whatever, 1st of November that year, unbeknownst to him, no real concerns. I mean, just all of a sudden he had some revelation, and he decided, he says, we're going to go to church. We're going to start going to church. And I was like, okay, you say, yes, sir, yes, Dad, okay. And they said, and you're going to youth group. Okay, some of you know that story. And I'm like, okay. Well, it was in youth group then that, my life, had a turn, had a metamorphosis, had a change, had a repentance. I was heading down the wrong street. And my dad didn't know it, but he got me there. And so suddenly, I really became aware of this thing called church. This enterprise, this organization, this grouping of people of whom there were 0 on planet Earth when Jesus walked here. See, when Jesus walked on the planet, there were 0 churches. Now, there were many times that Jesus said things, I'm sure, that made absolutely no sense to his followers, and I would dare say this is one of them. So if I were to say to you, well, have you seen the squiggly do? You'd say, what's a squiggly do? And you've never heard that word before. And I said, well, what do you think about a squiggly do? And so you might Google squiggly do. Well, you look it up, Google's like, I don't have a clue. And so then you might go to Google Translate and say, well, maybe he's like talking some foreign language or something. And you look, no, squiggly-doo just doesn't come up. So what's a squiggly-doo? Well, you say, well, maybe Pastor Kurt's speaking in tongues today. Well, if you've heard a word, that you've never heard before, you'd have no context for that word's meaning. That's exactly how Jesus felt. Like I say, squiggly-doo. That's how Jesus' followers heard the word church. It's hard for us to wrap our head around. It wasn't a word they'd ever heard before. It wasn't a concept that they had any affiliation for. And so in Matthew 16, beginning in verse 13, Jesus introduces this concept of church. And so we have to remember or realize Jesus is talking about something that didn't exist, but was going to exist. And so Jesus comes into the region at Caesarea Philippi, and he says to his disciples, well, who do people say that I am? And some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, others Jeremiah. No, they're all prophets to that point. And really, like, prophets, these highly revered people. So, and others say Elijah, and still others say Jeremiah. Just one of the prophets, Jesus. And he says, well, what about you? He says, well, who do you say that I am, Peter? So he's kind of narrowing it down. The first is a broad question. The second was like, Peter, who do you say that I am? Now, Simon Peter was the one who always got it wrong, but was always the first one to answer. He says, you are the Messiah, the blessed Son of the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, well, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this is not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but from my Father in heaven. So in other words, congratulations, Simon, you finally got one right. Then he says, but, and I tell you, you are Peter, and upon this rock, play on words there for them, rock, Peter, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Ashley did a good job of reading that for us. Bears reinforcing. The context, the conversation leading up to this is pretty fascinating. Now just think about this. This isn't chapter 1. This is like months, years into Jesus' journey. Matthew chapter 10. They've been traveling with Jesus. They've been watching him teach. They've been watching him perform miracles. And I can only imagine that their brains have been absolutely stretched. Who was this guy? He was embracing outcasts. He was touching lepers. He was saying that he was empowering women. There was so much going on that would make them think that he was maybe the Messiah. So he says, who do you think that I am? And because people like to talk, they responded, well, John the Baptist. Oh, that's pretty good compliment. Prophet Elijah, again, compliment. Jeremiah, compliment. You know, every one of those was complimentary. It's like if someone came alongside me and they saw me on my road bike and they said, hey, you look like Lance Armstrong. And I would say, well, is that before the doping scandal or after the doping scandal? I don't know which was it. Jesus, however, was greater than all of those that had been mentioned. And so it wasn't the huge compliment that it might have been. And by the way, that's a question that you and I also need to hear, right? Who do you say that Jesus is? Not who did your parents say Jesus was, or your spouse, or your Sunday school teacher, your neighbor, your pastor. Who did they say Jesus was? No. Who do you say Jesus is? So Simon Peter understood this was a personal question. It was aimed right at him. He said, you're the Messiah. And Peter says this, what he's actually saying, you, Jesus, are the fulfillment of everything that I've ever heard when I've gone to temple. You are the fulfillment of all the promises. Just think what that must have, the power of that statement coming from Peter. He says, you're the Messiah. You're the Christ, the Son of the living God, the one who has come to set us free. Jesus responds, Simon, you've got it right. And I tell you, you're a rock. And on this rock, I'll build my church, and the gates of hell not overcome it. And then he adds this incredible imagery to the power that's going to be entrusted to everyone. I bet you didn't know you had this power. He says, you hold the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Everything that you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Everything you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Jesus wants us to realize that when he says, I will build my church upon this rock, they had no idea what he was talking about. See, they weren't waiting for Jesus to come and build a church. They had no expectation that the Messiah would do anything other than bring all of Judaism together. Jesus wasn't there to start a new thing. He was there to complete an old thing. If you're the Messiah, you're the next chapter in the story of Israel. You're not the first chapter in the story of Christianity. And that's just something for us to kind of keep in our head there. You're the Messiah. You're the fulfillment. You're the culmination of all my hopes and dreams. All the promises that we've stored in our hearts that have come from God. You are that, Jesus. Jesus says, yeah. And upon you, I'm going to build my church. And if you're Peter and the disciples, you're like, what? What are you going to build? Now, this word church, it's a really cool word. In the Greek, ekklesia, okay? So, and it has two meanings. The first meaning is that we are the called out ones, okay? So we are the called out ones. That's the meaning of the word ekklesia. And so we're supposed to be called out from the world. That's where you have monks and you know, people who separate themselves. And so that's a very interesting use of the word. We're not a part of this mass of humanity. We are called out and separated from it. So the other way of looking at that word, ekklesia, is that we are the called out ones. Get it? That's the fun part. We're called out into the world. Okay? See, that's fun. I just had to do that. We're supposed to go out and make a difference. I actually think we can predict what a church will be like and how they understand this one word, ecclesia, church. Are we to separate by going out from the world, or are we to be out in the world? See, all that aside, Jesus was telling them that he had an idea. He had a plan called the church. Now, we would see that pretty soon churches, I mean, you think Jesus come up with some idea, it'd be like, sweet. You know, it's going to be like 100%. You can take that. You can go get, oh, man, what's the word where you take it and somebody can't copy it because it's perfect? What? Yeah, copyright. That's it. Thank you. Jeez. That you could, you know, that Jesus came up with it. It could be copyrighted. It's going to be perfect. But, you know, if you read the book of Corinthians, the people at Corinth, you can see that, well, no, the church would be anything but perfect. And the dysfunction at Corinth was just the tip of the iceberg. See, but messy was never to be an excuse for avoidance. And I think that's so important to understand why the church matters. It matters because it's through the church that God brings us together. Now, how many of us have either heard or know someone who says, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual? Yeah, a lot of us, right, yeah. And my general sense is that when people use that expression, see, their spirituality then is also individualistic. There's no sense of connection. But now with religion, it's got some heavy-duty baggage. It does. The church does. One of the guys I listen to on Sirius Radio says, oh, I like Jesus. It's his fan club that bothers me. And I get that. I mean, that's a really good phrase. And on occasion, I have said the greatest enemy to the movement of Jesus was, and for some extent is still today, the church. Right? I mean, just think of some of the awful things that the church has done. Think of some of the awful things that the church is doing today through the vehicle of politics. And so I understand why some people say, I don't want anything to do with the church. See, as flawed as it is, no matter what, the church matters because that's how God brings God's people together. And that's important because God doesn't need the church to connect you to him. There is one denomination that's their whole thing. You can't get to God unless you come through our doorway. But see, you don't need this church or any church to connect to God. You need Jesus to connect to God. And so when someone says to me, the church is not essential, I don't need the church to connect with God, you know what I say? You got me. You need Jesus to connect to God. But I'm not here to confuse that point. See, the problem is, while Jesus was walking on this earth, talking to his disciples, he said, I'm going to build the church. So the church matters. The church is important. And if you don't need the church to connect with God, why then would he build a church? Except that his goal, his reason for coming, wasn't only to connect us to himself, but to connect us to one another. Again, something Lisa alluded to so beautifully. And if we can be honest for a moment, sometimes it's easier to connect with God than it is to connect with people. The psalmist writes, the heaven declares his glory. I go, wow, easy button. I love that stuff. Just go to the mountaintop. I'm like, oh, hallelujah, I sense your presence, Lord. That person said they would do that. Why didn't they do it? You know? See, it's easy to love the Lord with all our God, with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind. It's the second half that gets sometimes a lot tougher. See, all too often down through the ages, the hard part of seeing God has been separating out the destructive behavior of people who say they are God followers. The distorted teachings that have been and continue to be tendered in God's name. Our hard work, though, what we have to do, those of us gathered here, is to combat, is to address, is to remove the false images of God that have been foisted upon us. See, I think loving God is easy. What's not to love? What's not to love about God? It's really hard to convince us to love each other. God, easy. People, all too often, unexpectedly messy. You ever meet someone and go, oh, wow, man, he's so handsome. He's so awesome. He's so amazing. That's because you don't know him yet. Or, wow, she's perfect. Well, let me tell you, don't marry her while you still think she's perfect. Because she's not. She's just her, you know. And if you can love someone in their imperfection, that's the miracle. And if you can love someone in their imperfection, that's the gift. I remember some years ago, Betsy and I were still in that stage of life, you know, marriage. She said to me, honey, why do you love me? And so I wanted to express unconditional love, right? So I said to her, I love you for no reason at all, honey. Didn't go so well. See, I had this beautiful romantic moment. And she says, so there's no reason to love me? No, that's not what I meant. And she said, oh, well, it's good to know there's no reason to love. I said, well, would you quit already? No. And I realized she didn't want unconditional love. She wanted conditional love. And I love you because. See, love becomes excellent when you finally can see someone for who they really are and you can still love them unconditionally. That's the miracle of the church. When people say, well, I don't go to church because there's too many hypocrites in the church, I think to myself, well, you're welcome to come and make it one more. Or I don't go to church because people let you down. Well, of course they do. You know? I don't go to church because people aren't what they appear. Yes, that's because, not because they go to church, that's because they're human. They just happen to be humans who go to church. So if you go over here to Toast and Roast, you don't say, well, I'm not going back there again, because everyone there's a hypocrite. And I also suspect you don't give up coffee because there's people who are not genuine over there. Or in times, I've gone to yoga class. I miss it. These people doing all these things I can't begin to do, you know, and they do all these wonderful moves. And then afterwards, I would see a few of them vaping, and I didn't say, well, I'm never going to go to yoga again, you know, just because of what they're doing. See, everywhere people look perfect, it's an illusion. It's only in the church where we are given the freedom. We don't always embrace it, but we're given the freedom to acknowledge I'm a mess. I'm broken. I'm imperfect. You know, calling me hypocritical is an upgrade, you know. I'm just a hypocrite in transition. I'm just working through the brokenness of who I am, and I've learned that I cannot do that alone. See, Jesus established a church so that we wouldn't do life alone. It's through the church that God brings us together, and if I could, you know, give you kind of a theological framework for life that isn't too negative, life can really suck at times. It can really be bad. It can really be painful and full of disappointment. And the people you love can disappear in the blink of an eye. And that what you thought you would have forever can be gone in an instant. And if you try to do that alone, it can be crushing. Jesus established a church not for himself, but for us, so that we could do life together.